welcome everyone to this week's Center for Southeast Asian Studies webinar series. Today we have the distinguished Professor Tung with us giving a talk. He's the Professor of Information Technology Management and the Faculty Director of the Vietnam Executive MBA program at the University of Hawaii. He holds the Matson Navigation Company Chair of Global Business, is chair of the Hawaii International Conference on System Sciences, and directs the Hawaii APEC Study Center and Pacific Research Institute for Information Systems and Management. So he has a lot of hats here at this university. His research interests include electronic commerce and the digital economy, economic evaluation of information technology and emergency response systems. Recent work explores e-marketing and customer experience, wargaming and complex systems, and information systems, international information systems. He has a PhD in computer science and information systems from NYU and a PhD in managerial economics from the University of Freiburg in Switzerland. And I'm excited we have a topic today on Vietnamese geoeconomics in a polarized global economy. So welcome.
Sorry. On behalf of the Center for Southeast Asian Studies, I would like to give you a link.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here today. And I'd like to thank you, the Center for Southeast Asian Studies. I am a member of the board, and it is an opportunity for me to at least doing something for the center. So when Miriam asked me to do something, I was actually happy to say yes to her invitation. As Irito mentioned, my primary area of research is in business and in looking at information technologies on how technology can help improve the business. So this topic is more on political science. So it is a little bit odd to some extent. And my presentation is not purely from a political science perspective, but mostly based on an economist perspective and looking at the statecraft from a perspective of decision making. I also would like to welcome those who are online. I wish that you would be here so that I could see your face and your body language, but then welcome to the seminar. And again, thank you to the center for having me. So let me handpick a couple of facts so that we can situate ourselves a little bit about the context of the presentation today. So when Xi Jinping was just re-elected for the third time in China, the president of Vietnam was the very first person who got invited for an official visit there. So that must be very important in terms of how the two leaders, China and Vietnam, consider themselves as very important. And then soon after Biden's election, the Prime Minister of Vietnam went to Washington, D.C. and gave a talk. And you all know that the US president is super busy when it got started. And yet enough, he spent quite a bit of time debating on the relationship between the two countries. And they highlight this is a major opportunity for the two countries to do something together. So, and then not too long ago, just a few weeks ago indeed, the European Union had an Asian summit, and they had a lot of private talk with Vietnam in the sideline, and they are devoting a lot of money in order to make Vietnam or the neighboring countries as an alternate production powerhouse in addition to China. So we have a lot of activities, and even yesterday when President Phuc, who was just on board for less than a year, got resigned, I just do a Google search on the news, and it is amazing enough that the whole world, including the Washington Post and the major news papers and media in the country, in the world, talk about this phenomenon, and they are questioning what is going to happen to Vietnam in terms of the political stability. So so all of this is just to tell you a little bit that there must be something particular about Vietnam that has got a lot of attention for the rest of the world. So as an economist, I'm very much as an IT person, I am very much interested in the ability of a country to use technology as part of the growth process of the economy. And then if you look at the Global Innovation Index done by the Swiss, Vietnam actually is basically situated as one of the top leaders in the middle income group. Actually, they were #1 2 years ago because of the COVID policy and the uncertainty in terms of how to handle COVID. Vietnam initially also had the same policy of a lockdown like China did. And then, so the competitiveness index went down a little bit. But if you look at the latest report from the World Bank that just released a couple of weeks ago, they predict that Vietnam is going to be recovering extremely well for 2022. So 21 was a dip, slightly dip, but we expect a full recovery or even more in 2022 and in 2023. So again, the question that I'm asking myself here is that Vietnam is ranked 47th or so among the world. Why is it has caught so much attention among the superpowers and also among its peers and the lesser state? So the brief answer to the question is basically it must have something to do with the bamboo strategy. So this is why I title the presentation today as the Vietnamese geoeconomics in a polarized global economy. So I know that I have a couple of students online in business, and maybe they are not very familiar, not much familiar about certain terms that I'm using here. So let me probably go back with some basic definition. So probably I think the best way to define geoeconomics is the art of conducting state affairs. And to gain 3 important dimensions, and I will be getting back to those 3 dimensions quite a bit in my presentation today. Basically, gaining peace, boosting economic prosperity, and through international relations. So please remember this definition throughout the presentation because I will be coming back to it quite often. And then what is geoeconomics? Basically, again, I think one of the easiest definition that I could think of is the use of economics to defend and promote national interest. And again, the word natural interest here is extremely important to me. And then everything that we do from the rest of the presentation today basically is focused on that concept of what is it for me as a national leader and what is it for me in order to protect my country. And then all of the actions actually is related to it. And then what are the instruments that a country can use in order to protect its national interest in promoting peace, boosting the economy, basically trade. You sign a bilateral agreement with China so that you can boost your economic relation. Obviously, investment in both ways, either to your country or to the partner country, financial and monetary tools. You have seen what the West economies have been doing to Russia in order to use monetary tools to sanction Russia. And then obviously energy and technologies is becoming increasingly extremely important. The US has been accusing China for cyber espionage, and this is a good example of looking at technology as a new emerging potential political instrument for implementing statecraft. Let me comment a little bit on the concept of polarized world. if you look at what is happening in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, naively, I thought that 20 years ago when I was working on the Y2K problem, I thought that it was the only major problem for the 21st century. And after we have solved the Y2K problem, the computer chip issue, then we should be at peace for a long time. But then it turned out to be not the case. And then if you see what is happening to the United Kingdom, the exit of the European Union, you could see that starting from there, one country after another one, including Brazil that you have seen for the last few days, that there is a global trend toward ideological extremes. And then now we are in a situation that we have a tug of war between nationalism versus globalism and conservatism and liberalism. And this is basically those two extremes that are fighting against each other. And then among this backdrop, obviously we heard all the time the tension between China and the US. Obviously, it's 2 different countries, it's 2 different cultures, 2 different political systems, and they happen to be the top 2 countries in the world in terms of national GDP, and therefore it's normal that it is happening. In the next slide, I will show you a little bit the long history of détente, we say in French, and tension between the 2 countries right after the inception of the People's Republic of China. And then it has been intensified since 2013, even under the Obama administration, in which people, on the one hand, try to work together, but on the other hand, there is always a backdrop of competition. And this is why I would like to use later on in my presentation the business concept of co-opetition. Basically, it's a concept of combining competition and collaboration together. So just to give you a little bit of some statistical backdrop over here, China is actually catching up very quickly to the US. The US still has a competitive advantage on the economic complexity index, an index computed by Harvard. Basically, what it means is that an economy would be in pretty good shape. It has a production system that is diversified enough, complex enough, intertwined enough, so that it could sustain competitiveness and innovation. China, obviously, if you look carefully at what they produce massive amount of things, but then they are not as diverse as the US economy can be. But it is actually growing up and catching up really, really fast. So this is basically the trend on the economic complexity index. Forget about Vietnam on the bottom for now. I will get back to it later on. Let me get some water. So the reason I wanted to show you this picture is basically to look at the countries that the 2 superpowers are working with. Interestingly enough, you can see even Vietnam as a relatively small economy, only 47th in the world. It has actually a major presence in the Chinese business. And then if you look on the right-hand side, Vietnam is a tiny bit somewhere in the bottom center, 0.76%. But actually, according to the CIA data, Vietnam is the #1 fast-growing business partner with the US. So geopolitics is basically a combination of economics and policy including the national security and national security, including obviously the military readiness. Okay, so look at the history between the US and China over the years since the inception of China in 1949, the creation of the PRC, the People's Republic of China. So you see, it has always been a tension while the US was fighting against North Korea, China was supporting it, and the issue about Taiwan, the issue about Tibet, the issue about Vietnam War, the US in the south and China in the north. And then when the Chinese were in trouble fighting against the Soviet Union, then obviously the US took side and supported China. And you all remember the famous trip from Nixon and Kissinger going to China, talking and opening China policy. And soon after, even the US supported the entrance of China to the World Trade Organization. And then soon after, they might realize that they must have done something wrong, maybe, that China is taking advantage of the WTO so much, so good, in such a way that they become the US largest creditor. And then Obama started to raise concern about the quick rise of China, and then they tried to figure out what to do about it. And you all know in recent past, the major trade war initiated by President Trump and then continued and supported by the Biden administration. And just 2 or 3 days ago, the US representative voted in order to figure out how to deal with the uprising Chinese competitiveness. So you can see that it is like a roller coaster, going up, going down. And there are, whenever competition is good, they would do that. Whenever collaboration is good, they would do that as well. So this is a marriage that is actually very interesting. So now if you look at the national security aspect of statecraft, obviously one of the biggest issues nowadays is the quick rise of the Chinese military. And then actually there was an article in CNN yesterday from a military expert. He claimed that soon enough, China will be the #1 superpower in terms of naval warfare. And then a week past from today, the US was actually conducting naval drills in the Middle East, I'm sorry. And then quickly this morning, China announced that they would do the exact same thing next week in the Middle East again, using the Shandong aircraft carrier. This is 100% made by the Chinese technology. So this is actually quite interesting to see that there is certainly a concept of a tit for tat in the situation. So the backdrop of my presentation here is that indeed the tension between China and the US is real, and it has all the likelihood of getting more tense in the future. So if we have some top powers in the top, what happens to the rest of the world? And obviously, if naturally you go down from the top to a lower level, you would run into something that political scientists call middle powers. So what is the middle power in my presentation today? I would define it as the ability to deploy political and economic sanction to defend actions, to defend national interest against greater powers, and try to rise in the geopolitical hierarchical order. So this is actually to me, a very classical, little bit outdated to some extent, that if you are being ranked, and if you are ranked lower than the people above you, the only thing that you want to do is to work really hard to climb the ladder. So that is basically what you want to do. And obviously, when you follow the leader, you try to copy as much as what they do, economically speaking, socially speaking, and monetary speaking. So you just follow the leader, and you would like to copy that model and try to go up and catch up as fast as you can. So, but then when I was talking to Erito before the presentation today, I was thinking a little bit. If there were only two superpowers in the world, China and the US, what happens to other countries who are quite amazing, like Japan, for example, Germany, another thing. And then, so what happens to these people? Interestingly enough, authors in the literature still qualify Japan and Germany as middle power. In fact, they are actually quite powerful to some extent. And when they join forces together, they could be as powerful as the European Union. So this is why I took the liberty to add in the bottom of my slide a new concept of emerging middle power. And the idea is a little bit different here. The idea here is that I think it would take me a little bit more time in order to catch up to the top level. Even some of the Vietnamese scholars argue that it would take at least 2 or 3 generations for the Vietnamese economy to catch up to South Korea. And so dreaming that Vietnam would be up to the German level would take some time to do it. So instead of remaining a low level middle power all the time and try to take a lot of time to catch up, there might be an emerging perspective. And the idea is, what can I do in order to have a play in that world? So to me, one way to do it, and the Vietnam case is basically showing it in this presentation today, is that there is a possibility to become powerful if a middle power get out and seek a lot of multilateral collaboration and compromise. And a second way, in order to become noticed in the world level, is to show that we are a good international citizen trying to do good things, and therefore we might be able to catch the attention of the greater powers. So this is exactly the context that I would like to quickly talk today. How is Vietnam trying to implement the emerging perspective of middle power presentation? So from a theoretical perspective, the way I wrote this paper is that I took a deductive approach to my analysis, looking what Vietnam has been doing in reality and try to extract some theoretical concept based on it. So the concept that I would like to promote in the presentation today is the 3 items that we have in the bottom. Whatever the Vietnamese do, what they have done is anchored in those 3 dimensions, which I would like to talk a little bit in the next thing. So again, for some of you in the presentation today who are not 100% familiar about what is happening to Vietnam today, those are some of the interesting facts. But then from a perspective of geoeconomics and geopolitics, I think this map is actually more interesting to look at. Vietnam is somewhere in the south of China and then surrounded by maritime channels. The South China Sea and the Gulf of Thailand, which is actually quite important in terms of global supply chain and transportation of goods and services, and even in the case of international or regional war, those sea channels would be extremely important for any country engaging in any possible international conflict. And then another map that is actually quite interesting over here is that despite the fact that Vietnam and China has a love-hate relationship for more than 10 centuries, and I know that many Vietnamese don't like the Chinese at all. The fact that they are stuck forever in terms of geographical location. There is no way for you to move Vietnam to Australia or Vietnam to the neighbor of the United States. So this is a reality that Vietnam has a huge big brother or whatever in the north, and like it or not, you would have to deal with it forever. And then if you look at the economy of Vietnam, only $300 billion, that you can see the two major partners, the three major partners actually, the China, the United States, and South Korea. And South Korea, as you know, we just talked to them 2 months ago when I was in Seoul. South Korea has identified Vietnam to be soon their #1 economic partner. So, but then the relationship here is even more interesting. If you look at my text on the right-hand side, the Vietnamese buy a lot of raw materials from China. This is why there is a big deficit there. But then on the other hand, they sell a lot of things that they produce to the United States as a finished product. And as a consequence, the deficit to China is actually not that bad. Actually, the bigger the deficit could turn out to be a good thing for the Vietnamese economy. And then, as I mentioned to you a little bit earlier, Vietnam keep exporting more to the US, and then they just hit another surplus, a record surplus this year in 2022. This is another evidence that Vietnam has become and being considered as a bigger power in East Asia. So how did Vietnam get there? And I think the answer to it is what they call the bamboo diplomacy. And actually, this is not new. If you search bamboo diplomacy, there are quite a few publications and discussion and debate on the bamboo diplomacy. I think the contribution of this paper in that massive amount of literature is basically toward the end of my presentation on testing the viability of that bamboo diplomacy. So as a metaphor, what does it mean? You all know what a bamboo is, right? We have plenty of them actually in Hawaii as well. It has very strong roots. It grows really fast, very ecological. It is very flexible and elastic. And then if you cut it in half, it has rings in the middle and it's hollow inside. And then obviously because of the flexibility of the grass, it actually can be very resilient against strong wind. The soft power beating the hard power, so to speak. So in terms of geoeconomics, or politics, what does it mean? Basically, it means that Vietnam has a practicing dualism, a firm principle, but then when it comes to implementation, they try to be as pragmatic, as adaptable as possible. So for the sake of doing international relations, they always use peace, friendship, cooperation, and development. This is basically very true to whatever the Vietnamese leadership is doing. Anytime they run into an official high-level meeting, they always repeat their position as a very firm principle. But then in terms of implementation, they translate their philosophy into a non-alignment principles, the 4 nodes that you can see on the bottom of the slide. And just recently, in October 2022, the defense minister of Vietnam said it again in Singapore that Vietnam is trying to protect itself, getting more military acquisition in order to preserve and protect and implement its non-alignment principle. So this is basically what Vietnam has been doing. They get, because of the fact that they are catching attention from the great powers, they're trying to find a way in which that they can find an area of mutual interest. So whenever they are facing with a partner, they always look at an area of mutual interest and the area that they could find a collaboration. So for example, when the leader of Vietnam goes to China, they always highlight the fact that the two countries have centuries of historical brotherhood, and therefore there is no reason for them to keep fighting, but instead of maintaining brotherly peace. And then when they go to Russia, basically they want Russia to be their comprehensive strategic partner, doing business with them, doing military collaboration with them. And then recently they went to the US, and they would like to look at something that the US is very much interested in, basically how to maintain national security in Southeast Asia and the East Asia. And then they just met with they talked to East Asia, to the Asian nations, and then the buzzword and the slogan here would be to promote cooperation for mutual benefits. So you can see the concept of multilateralism is obvious here, but then it's very targeted in looking at the area of mutual interest. So how do they engineer the bamboo statecraft? So on the left-hand side, you have the characteristics of a bamboo that I mentioned to you a little bit earlier. And on the right-hand side of the slide, you see a little bit what the Vietnamese has been doing in order to qualify as a bamboo strategy. Obviously, one of the major advantage of the Vietnam's economy for the last 3 decades, and Ben knows it for a fact, is that the Vietnamese always claim that come and do business with me because I have a very stable single-party political system. You don't have to worry about it. If you look at a country like Italy, which is one of the most democratic countries in the world, but then they have like at least 60 different governments since 1945, the end of the Second World War. It's a fast-growing economy. As I mentioned to you, the World Bank estimates that Vietnam is going to have a growth of 7+% this year. Flexible and elastic, as I mentioned earlier, they go out and they practice a multi-tier type of bilateral and multilateral alliances with whomever they think they could collaborate with. And then some detractors of the Vietnam policy would argue that you go out, you sign a lot of MOUs, a lot of agreements, but maybe it's hollow inside. You don't even know what you are doing. And therefore, even for detractors, the bamboo strategy seems to be fitting into the context of the Vietnamese statecraft. And then, as I mentioned to you, as an economist, we promote and cooperation and competition in the business world. Basically, on the one hand, nurture a stable relations between the two key allies for the recent history, China and Russia. But then on the other hand, Vietnam has been aggressively modernizing its military readiness using Western technologies, in particular with the United States. So how would I conceptualize the bamboo strategy? I would argue that there are 3 forces or 3 factors that basically help explain the situation. Number 1 is historical heritage. The this is intuitively, I think, whatever we do, we carry on our shoulders a lot of history. And then whatever we do today, we seems to be anchoring our today's decision based on the history that we have had in the past. So in the next slide, I will instantiate this argument. But then before doing that, leaders tend to focus on the recent history, and then the people, the general population, tend to have a collective memory. For example, I just went to Korea for a APEC meeting 2 months ago. I took a Uber drive from the airport to the hotel. Then the Korean taxi driver was still talking about what they have suffered from the Japanese like half a century ago. So still that thing. And I went to Vietnam in October. I met some older people, older than me. They still talk about what they had when they were fighting against the French, even it is almost a century ago. So the collective memory is still there. And then the recent history is still in the mind of the leaders when they have to talk about it. So every country, I argue, that when they engineer a statecraft, they have that baggage of history in their mind or in their shoulders. So if you look at the Vietnam situation here, this is actually very interesting. Vietnam has 10 centuries of love-hate relationship with China. And then they had 30 years of fight in the Vietnam War. And then they have 50 years of love and hate relationship with the Vietnamese overseas who escaped Vietnam in 1975. And that's why all of these things, when they get together, they have one unifying factor, which is basically the shared Confucianism that they have been trained in their history. And you can see that anytime you see the leaders of China and Vietnam getting together, they always talk about the fact that they have some shared political ideology, communism, the welfare of the people and everything. And then this is basically the concept of historical heritage and explaining why the Vietnamese have been doing that. A second factor to me is the concept of spatial proximity. So you saw the picture that I showed earlier, the big China on the top in the north and the south, and the small country in the south. Basically, again, there is the presence, the geographical presence actually dictates quite a bit the way we shape geopolitics. So why is it after the pandemic, Vietnam has been so successful in terms of being considered as an alternate or an addition to China production powerhouse? Very simple. When Japan or Korea or even the Germans decide to move some of the factory or to invest more factories in Vietnam, because of the fact that they can transfer some of the technologies and experience they have had from China down to Vietnam, and they still need collaboration along the supply chain network between the two countries. Being next to each other is always easier, and then same culture, same experience learned from China that could be probably imported and applied to Vietnam. And therefore, the spatial proximity actually turned out to be a competitive advantage for Vietnam's geoeconomics. A third factor, I would argue that there are certain factors independent to the Vietnamese leader, which I define it as a exogenous driving force within the ecosystems of states. Basically, what is the ecosystem of states? Basically, the close partnership or the close network of partners, nation partners that Vietnam is partnering with. Okay, so it all depends on how intense, how frequent, and how fast you are able to attract FDI in order to build your geo-economic force. So if you look quickly at the bottom here, you could see, as I mentioned a little bit earlier, that Vietnam has been successful in getting FDI, foreign investment, from the multinational firms, and then Vietnam has also been able to maintain the balance of power. So they go to the US seeking help, but they also reassure at the same time to the Chinese that don't worry about it. We just want to modernize our force, but we are not going to fight against you, which is actually a little bit odd to some extent. Okay. So I'm running a little bit of time, so let me quickly talk about how resilient the bamboo strategy is. So I started the presentation today arguing that Vietnam, for some reason, either by luck or by thoughtful strategy, it has been able to do whatever it needs to do. And then the question is that can they continue to do the same thing in the near future? So let me get into the meat of my presentation today. I'm proposing 2 viability tests to figure out if the Vietnamese keep doing what they have been doing using their bamboo strategy, are they going to be continued to be successful, or they might fall apart? So let me start with the Krasner's concept of organized hypocrisy. So the idea is very simple, and amazingly, the work was published in 1999, and basically 2 decades after, it turned out to be even more true. National leaders have a desire to stay in power, and then if national interests are at stake, national leaders tend not to honor international legal rules. And you have seen that in the last few years. Leaders in many countries kept violating international norms. So this is your problem. I expect you to follow the order, the word order, but it doesn't apply to me. And we have seen that. And then the interesting thing about the bamboo strategy is that they say, let them do whatever they want to do. I'm going to find my flexible way to engage in the world order, the world cooperation. And I would argue here is that as long as a bamboo strategy doesn't negatively impact the organized hypocrisy of great powers, then people would leave them alone. So don't touch them, then you are okay. So basically, let me give you an example here in the bottom. Recently, Vietnam has been going out buying a lot of Western weapons, but then they kept going back to their 2 allies, China and Russia, and say that we are brothers, we share the same geo-economical and historical and cultural values. And then with Russia, I'm still willing to consider doing military drills with you. So you buy American weapons, but then you still want to do military training and drilling with Russia. So again, if the bamboo strategy doesn't hurt the greater power, I think it would tend to survive in the future. The second test is to borrow some of the work that I've done in decision theory. And in decision theory, there is a concept by Marquis de Condorcet, a very famous French philosopher in the 18th century. Sorry, it's not 1975, it's 1795. I messed up with the date. So according to Marquis de Condorcet, you can make a safe choice if you satisfy 2 conditions, the condition of concordance and the conditions of discordance. Say about this. Why is it a few years ago under Germany, under Angela Merkel, she wanted to do away with all of the nuclear power plants. The reason is very simple. The condition of concordance is completely met. A nuclear power plant is basically good in everything, clean, efficient, powerful, but then there is a condition of discordance that is really against a nuclear power plant, is that if there is a radioactivity leak, then what would happen to the safety of the citizens? And therefore, if you want to have a good social choice, you need only to make sure that the majority of the factor is in favor of that choice, but also there is no single factor that is against it. So how does it apply to Vietnam's geoeconomics? If you look at the thing over here, if Vietnam is trying to go out and argue to the rest of the world, forget about China and go to Vietnam, we are able to absorb everything that you would want to do, then you might irritate the neighbor up north. But then the Vietnamese are smart enough by saying that, no, we don't want to do that. We want to attract more FDI. We want to be a more active part of the production system of the world. But then we just want to be an addition to China production powerhouse. And this is exactly what they have done. And if you look at the amount of the top 20 FDI that Vietnam got in 2022, out of 30 top of them, 17 of them actually are from Chinese companies. So the message actually has been somehow heard, and the condition of imposed by Marquis de Condorcet seems to be observed. And a third one, which is to me probably the most difficult one, is to go back to the basic concept of the logic system in policy formulation. So in business, we have a concept of local versus global optimization. You may want to do something that is good for you, but then by doing that, you might hurt the whole thing. Simple example, the computer department may argue that in order to save money for IT maintenance, I would sign a contract that only if 5 computers are down, then I would put in the box and ship it to the factory to maintain. It is much cheaper than shipping 1 computer at a time whenever it is down. But then by doing that, suppose if I work in the department in a lab and my computer is down, I need to get it running. I take the computer down to the computer department and they say, Mr. Bui, you have to wait until I got 4 more in order to get out to fix it. And therefore I am down for a long time, which I don't even know. So back here, we have the same situation as well. If Vietnam goes out on a bilateral mode, they sign a contract with the Indonesian people, they sign a contract with the Japanese, they sign a contract with South Korea. What happens if they all put things together? Would it work as a whole, as opposed to look at the whole thing? This is exactly the situation that we had with the US under the Trump administration, thinking about doing bilateral relationship and not listening to the basic model of the World Trade Organization. So a possibility that if you don't engineer your statecraft policy carefully, you might explode. And the theory of explosion here is that if you have a lot of contradiction in combining many isolated agreements together, you might end up to have a disastrous situation. So this is basically the use case in the bottom. They try to do as much as they can and minimizing the possible contradiction between what they do. So far, I would argue that the bamboo strategy seems to survive. But then how do we look into the future? And it would take me 2 more minutes, 2 and 3. So I guess slowly, and maybe by force or by choice, Vietnam should be moving to what I would define as an e-bamboo strategy. E standing for electronic. So the idea here is that we have done as much as we can in terms of the physical world, and then geopolitics seems to be migrating into the digital platform with cyber money, cyber economy, cyber security, and cyber production, you name it. And therefore, Vietnam is trying to beef up its IT infrastructure and capability. The challenge, this is actually very interesting. Even Vietnam is a young economy. The business model so far is low labor cost, but then it is actually facing already a severe lack of skilled labor force. And then the major problem here in the context of the e-bamboo strategy is the fact that they are facing the competition of automation. So there is a possibility that there will be an increase in unemployment of human laborers because of the fact that Vietnam is moving very quickly into automation nowadays. And then another problem that Vietnam is facing right now is still that it is not getting out of the current investors' culture. I have worked with a lot of students of mine creating new projects, new companies, new startups. And then whenever my students present an innovative idea, then investors would ask the very first question, has it been successful overseas? So if you do a startup in Vietnam and you say that I built this model because it was successful in the US, because it was successful in Germany, then it would be likely successful in Vietnam. But then if you have something that is completely, truly new, then they would say, too risky, I don't like it. So this is a culture that we need to defeat somehow to do that. And then, as I mentioned, based on the 3 tests that I had presented earlier, I don't know what happens if the rising economy, like India, for example, is going to do the same thing that Vietnam is doing. And therefore, we haven't solved the issue between Vietnam and peer level middle state. So in a way, Vietnam is somehow on the right track. If you look at all of the products that it's exported in 2020, you can see on the blue thing, it's still a lot of technology there. So obviously producing hardware is the easy thing to do. Producing software and knowledge-based application is much more difficult, but I think they already have a good start right there. So final remark, I think it has been able to use the bamboo strategy to solidify its status. But then by doing the things that I have on the slide over here, the 3 factors that I mentioned, historical heritage, spatial proximity, and then some luck in terms of the factors surrounding the country. But then the question is that how long will the honeymoon last? So as a business professor, when I get into a difficult question, I always say it depends. So it depends, obviously, based on the 3 abilities of the country to do here. How, if you have to work on a very tight rope, how do you work carefully so that you don't break the rope? I think basically it is the necessary condition, and the sufficient condition to me is how to embrace technology in order to make yourself stronger in the digital economy of the future. So looking into the future, and this is the end of my presentation, I would see 2 possible scenarios. One that is basically unsuccessful. I could think of a situation where that Vietnam is trying to do too many things that would irritate a lot of people, and then they might decide to stop working with the country, and then they would have to go back to the old middle power model, which is basically taking side of the one side, either go with the Chinese or the Russian or the US, and then with all of the risk and the benefit that go along. But then if the bamboo strategy continues to be successful, it would be probably a model diplomacy for middle power that are rising and aspiring. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Tung, for a really comprehensive and thoughtful presentation. We're going to take questions. I really like that metaphor of bamboo, or sort of bamboo diplomacy, and the idea of bending but not breaking, and also continuing to grow, right? So that's the thing about bamboo. It's just it keeps moving up. So I can see how that's an attractive metaphor to understand what's going on. I think maybe we'll open up the floor to questions in the room first, and then we'll take any questions that are coming through the chat online, and Ima will let us know if and when there are any questions from online. So are there any questions in the room initially?
So if I may, you talked about the role of the middle power, and not very long ago, as a matter of fact, while I think I was in Vietnam, Vietnam brokered really a historic meeting between then President Trump and Kim Jong-un of the DPRK. Is that an example of the flexibility of a middle power doing something that, frankly, in my lifetime, I never thought I would see a U.S. president and the leader of the DPRK sitting down? Vietnam played an important role.
So this is, thank you for the question. Actually, I had this slide on that summit, but then I took it out. Now I'm happy that you are asking the question again. So the fact that the two countries, North Korea and Vietnam, chose Hanoi for their summit, and the Singaporeans, the Swiss actually were trying to offer that possibility of hosting them, and then they went to Vietnam. Even if the outcome was not positive, but it sent a lot of signal to the rest of the world that Vietnam could be able to play an important role.
That middle role, that middle
That's
power
right.
role.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Ben, you have a question?
I was just going to say that presentation has similarities to or builds on, I think would be a better way of putting it, David Elliott's book, which came out maybe 10 years ago. I think it was called something like Changing Worlds. David Elliott was trying in this book to understand how the state of Vietnam moved and adapted to the changing world that it found itself in the late 80s as Eastern Europe was collapsing. Because up to that point, at least for several decades, Vietnam as a state in the northern part of Vietnam before unification, and then afterwards, 75, the state was basically constrained by alliances and trade, et cetera, with communist countries, not only China and Russia, but Eastern Europe, as well as a bit of Cuba and Korea. So the mindset of that kind of long-term diplomacy had to shift after things happened in the communist world. And David's book tries to understand the debates that were going on within the leadership and the economists and others in Vietnam to move in a direction that now you've called the bamboo diplomacy. He doesn't use that term, but it fits a lot with what you've said. What you've said fits a lot with what David shows was evolving in the late 80s and early 90s in Vietnam. I mention it partly because if you haven't seen the book, you might enjoy it even more now, given what you're doing in your current work?
Thank you. I will be looking into it. But then what you have just said would fit into my dimension of historical heritage.
Yeah.
So whatever we do, we are uniquely linked to our own history. And this is part of the history that Vietnam has had. Yes, Miriam.
Thank you for that talk. It's very interesting and made me wonder about Japan, South Korea, I guess a little bit Taiwan versus Vietnam. In some of those countries, particularly in South Korea and Japan, they were these places of major American conflict and intervention. Then received great boosts under authoritarian regimes, but great boosts from America and became these economic powers. Maybe they're not the superpowers, but they're very strong economies. And it seems like what you're suggesting is that bamboo is only strong as long as it's a single party state, right? So can Vietnam ever become more democratic than it is and still be successful economically? Because it seems like maybe not. Maybe you need that. And I say that because I work in Cambodia, and the argument has been made there that we need a monolithic, we need a strong one-party state because we need economic development. And people largely capitulate. Those who don't get punished, and most of them capitulate because they want economic development. But Vietnam is so much farther along, so much bigger. It just makes me wonder, like, could you imagine a multi-party system developing in Vietnam with that strong, robust middle power economy?
Well, I guess the key issue is to maintain political stability so that investors feel good to get in. I mean, again, as a business professor, investors are, one thing that investors hate the most would be uncertainty. And therefore, if you can say that even if we are corrupted, but we will stay corrupted, there's nothing changed. And therefore, people seems to be a little bit more reassured in putting their money in. Having said this, I've been thinking quite a bit about your question actually over the years. And then if you look at what is happening as we speak right now, as Vietnam is looking for a replacement for the president, and there are 4 or 5 potential candidates right now. And within the single party, I guess there must be a lot of negotiation happening right now, because that even within the party, I would argue, and history have shown that, and facts have shown that as well, there are different factions within the same party in order to negotiate. I listened to the radio this morning from France. Basically, discuss about a potential candidate from the South, because they argue that the 4 most important leaders in the country are currently all North Vietnamese, and they wish to have a new leader coming from the South. So having said that, the country has only one party, but in fact, there are things happening within the party. So the question is, either you have in the US 2 opposite parties explicitly declared, or if you have a mono party, but they are debating inside that party. So I guess, pragmatically speaking, it ends up to be more or less the same, except for the other aspect of the system.
I feel like in the 80s and 90s, people might have said, that there's kind of this East Asian, this sort of Korea, Taiwan model where these countries undergo economic change, and then eventually there's also some kind of political change that comes out after. But in the 2020s, I'm not sure if that, that same argument kind of holds. I mean, it's still an open question. You have the Singapores, and you have the, you have the obviously the Chinas and the other states that are developing economically, having strong systems that are largely stable and predictable, and therefore attracting a lot of investment and growing. And there's not necessarily a sense. I mean, part of my question was also about this. You know, specifically, I don't know what the right word is. I'm sort of surprised and impressed, I guess, that China and Vietnam can have these relatively strong enough diplomatic relations that, you know, that the president is one of the first visitors to Xi Jinping, even though there's deep, deep territorial conflicts that are going on between these two countries. And I also know there have occasionally been sort of like domestic demonstrations, right, against the regime for maybe not being strong enough, or against China, right? So I guess, you know, in a middle power strategy, you talk about a lot of different kinds of interests, you know, sort of security interests, economic interests, these kinds of things. But in many ways, the security interests are sometimes existential. So I just wondered how do you do that? Like, how do you maintain those sort of tricky relations in a context where, you know, there's a clear sort of military and security threat or perception of a threat to your country?
Well, this is exactly what I was trying to do with the third axiomatic test. I clearly understand that by trying to build ties with a lot of people, and many of them are antagonists, obviously you will make people unhappy. Say if Bill and you are foes, and then one day you see him having dinner with him, the next day he see him be dining with you, he wouldn't be too happy. And this is basically what I define as the concept of tie. Very teamwork by building that network of statecraft relations. But then this is something that is magical about the bamboo strategy. It still amazes me that because of historical heritage, because of spatial proximity with China, and because of certain circumstantial phenomena like the COVID-19 and the conflict, the tension between the US and China, and even now between the rest of the world and Russia, Vietnam seems to be able to take advantage of it, which is quite amazing. So in our MBA program we have in Vietnam, we have Korean students, we have Japanese students and things like that. And they coexist beautifully well in the Vietnamese classroom. But then I know that many Korean students don't even want to go to Japan and study. So, yeah, so Vietnam has become like a medium that we could coexist somehow.
It seems really fragile to me.
It is.
I mean, I know it's resilient, and it also seems fragile.
It is.
It's not just a perceived threat from China. China's invaded, you know, 1,000 years, as the Vietnamese say. Yeah, it's really interesting because working in Cambodia, I mean, they're in the pocket of China, and they've been considered a protectorate of China for almost 2,000 years, from China's point of view. I'm not saying from Cambodia's point of view. But Vietnam has always stepped out and had so much more autonomy.
So the three theories that I presented earlier, basically there is a tipping point where the policy could continue to be successful, or it could just collapse. And then the issue is that I think the science and the art of running the bamboo strategy is to make sure that you push yourself to the edge of the tipping point, but not cross over it. And this is basically, I think, the challenge of the Vietnamese leaders.
It also assumes a status quo, that things don't fundamentally change in the international system. So Thailand famously had their bamboo kind of sort of strategy, you know, between the Allies and the Axis powers during World War II.
And even before.
And even before, yeah. But eventually, you know, one side won, and so then they had to sort of work out what to do in that kind of context. And that sort of leads me to a question about Indonesia is also really famous for having their kind of like free and independent foreign policy. So again, a kind of bamboo strategy, not taking particular sides. And I'm wondering, is there a strategy among these middle powers to have stronger relations, or is it, are the interests between the middle powers too fragmented really to even have that much coordination or alliance building?
Yeah, I see your question in two parts. I think the first part is that how is it Thailand was so successful during or before the war, and now they are not continuing that success. And again, because of the fact that I contend that the success of the bamboo strategy, at least in the Vietnam case, depends on the three factors, and those three factors must be met at the same time. Vietnam happens to be the neighbor of China, and Thailand is not. So, like Japanese factories would prefer, or even American factories and the Sweden, the people who make the company that makes the Legos, just put $1.1 billion in Vietnam to build a factory there. And the reason is that they already have a factory in the southern part of China, and moving the technology and the materials from the Chinese factory location to the Vietnamese location seems to be much easier than going through a lot of Thailand, Cambodia, Laos in order to get into Thailand. Would be a little bit more difficult. So the spatial proximity to me is one of the necessary conditions that make Vietnam successful as it is today.
Well, what happens once all the railroads are built as part of the Belt and Road? I suppose that might change the calculus, right? When China can zoom through Laos and go directly to Thailand, maybe that will.
Yeah, I mean, again, it depends on the economic calculus. I think if benefit exceeds costs, then whatever. Actually, a few years ago, I talked with a national country manager of Li Feng. Li Feng is the world number one logistic company based in Hong Kong. They do a lot of supply chain kind of thing. And she told me that Vietnam is benefiting from the supply chain network. But if labor costs continue to rise, companies might move out from Vietnam and go to Myanmar. And therefore, this is why I mentioned in my last presentation, the technological transformation is going to be quite important to keep the model going.
Any other questions, follow-up questions? Is there anyone on line that has any questions?
They're sleeping, I guess.
It's late over there. Well, we're a few minutes early, but people can stay and sort of discuss. But I just want to say thank you for a great presentation, engaging discussion.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, that was great. Are you going to give a similar presentation for